Angela Thompson stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully adjusting her navy blue blazer and making sure her natural hair was perfectly styled. Today was her first day at Riverside High School, and she wanted everything to be perfect. After 15 years of teaching at various schools and earning multiple Teacher of the Year awards, she had finally landed her dream job teaching AP English Literature. The morning sun was bright as she pulled into the school parking lot in her modest Honda Civic. The red brick building of Riverside High stood proud against the clear blue sky, its windows gleaming in the morning light. Several other teachers were walking in, carrying their coffee cups and bags, chatting and laughing as they prepared for the new school year. Angela grabbed her carefully prepared folder of lesson plans and teaching materials. Her husband Marcus had helped her organize everything the night before. "You've got this, honey," he had said, giving her a supportive kiss. "They're lucky to have you." Marcus never mentioned it, but Angela knew he was proud that his wife had beaten out 50 other candidates for this prestigious position. As she walked through the main entrance, Angela noticed the school's trophy cases lining the halls, filled with academic and athletic achievements. The school had a reputation for excellence, which was exactly why she had worked so hard to get here. A friendly-looking woman with gray hair approached her. "You must be Mrs. Thompson. I'm Sarah Miller, the English department head. We're so excited to have you join us," Sarah said warmly, extending her hand. "Your recommendations were incredible, and your teaching philosophy exactly matches what we need for our AP program." Sarah led Angela to the main office to meet the principal, chatting about the school's writing program along the way. However, the pleasant atmosphere changed the moment they stepped into Principal Robert Werner's office. Werner was a tall man in his 50s, with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses. He barely looked up from his computer when they entered. "Oh yes, the new teacher," he said flatly, finally glancing at Angela. His handshake was quick and loose, almost dismissive. "Mrs. Thompson comes to us with outstanding credentials," Sarah began enthusiastically. Her previous students had a 98% pass rate on the AP exam, and she's published several articles on teaching methods. Werner's response was a curt nod. "Just make sure you follow our school protocols exactly, Mrs. Thompson. We have very high standards here at Riverside." His tone carried an unspoken suggestion that he doubted she could meet those standards. Sarah's smile faltered slightly as she noticed the principal's cold demeanor. She had seen Werner welcome other new teachers warmly just days before, with friendly conversations about their backgrounds and teaching philosophies. This interaction was noticeably different. After a brief and uncomfortable meeting, Sarah showed Angela to her classroom. "Don't mind Mr. Werner," she whispered. "He can be particular sometimes." Both women knew that particular wasn't the right word for what they had just experienced. Angela's classroom was at the end of the English hall, the furthest from the department office. It was smaller than the other rooms, and the air conditioning barely reached it. As she began setting up her desk, she noticed her class roster had more students than the standard AP class size. Throughout the morning, other teachers stopped by to introduce themselves. Many seemed genuinely excited to meet her, especially after hearing about her experience and success rate. However, she couldn't help but notice the whispered conversations that stopped when she walked past the teacher's lounge, or the way some staff members glanced at her with sympathy. During the department meeting that afternoon, Werner made it a point to question Angela's proposed reading list in front of everyone, despite it being identical to what the school had used in previous years. "Are you sure you can handle teaching these complex texts?" he asked, his tone condescending. As Angela drove home that evening, she thought about calling Marcus. As a police captain, he had dealt with his share of discrimination in his rise through the ranks. But she decided against it for now. She wanted to handle this professionally, to prove herself through her work and let her results speak for themselves. What she didn't know was that this was just the beginning of what would become a challenging battle against deep-rooted prejudice. But Angela Thompson had never backed down from a challenge, and she wasn't about to start now. She had worked too hard to get here, and she was determined to succeed, no matter what obstacles Principal Werner put in her way. 2 weeks into the school year, Angela Thompson was already proving herself to be an exceptional teacher. Her students were engaged, her lesson plans were detailed, and parents were sending positive emails about their children's newfound interest in literature. However, Principal Werner's behavior was becoming increasingly problematic. It started with the observations. While it was normal for principals to observe new teachers, Werner showed up in Angela's classroom 3 times in one week. He would sit in the back, scribbling notes furiously, his face twisted in a permanent frown. Other new teachers mentioned he had only observed them once, and some hadn't been observed at all. During third period on a Wednesday morning, Werner walked in unannounced while Angela was teaching To Kill a Mockingbird. Her students were having an animated discussion about racism and justice in the American South. Werner's face darkened as he listened to the conversation. "Mrs. Thompson," he interrupted, "I need to see your lesson plans for this discussion. Now." His voice was sharp, cutting through the classroom atmosphere like a knife. The students fell silent, watching uncomfortably as their teacher calmly walked to her desk and handed him her perfectly prepared plans. Later that day, Werner called Angela into his office. "Your lesson plans lack structure," he claimed, despite them following the exact template the school provided. "And I'm concerned about your choice of discussion topics. We need to maintain a neutral environment." Sarah Miller, the English department head, happened to be walking by when she heard Werner's voice rising. She paused near the office, pretending to organize papers while listening. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Werner was criticizing Angela for teaching the exact same material that had been in the curriculum for years. The harassment didn't stop there. Werner assigned Angela lunch duty 4 days a week, while other teachers only had it once. He scheduled her prep period for the end of the day when she was most tired, and gave her the most difficult combination of classes. Her requests for basic classroom supplies were repeatedly lost or delayed. One morning, Angela found an anonymous note in her mailbox from a fellow teacher. "Document everything. We see what's happening." She started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction with Werner, noting dates, times, and witnesses. During a faculty meeting, Werner publicly questioned Angela's grading methods. "Mrs. Thompson," he announced to the room full of teachers, "your grades seem unusually high. Are you sure you're not being too lenient?" The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Everyone knew Angela's students were simply performing well because of her excellent teaching. Melissa Chen, a science teacher sitting next to Angela, quietly slid her phone over. She had recorded Werner's comment. "Add it to your evidence," she whispered when Werner wasn't looking. "We got your back." After school that day, Angela was grading papers when Sarah Miller came to her classroom. She closed the door carefully behind her. "Angela, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice low. "Werner did this before, at his last school. A Black history teacher filed a complaint, but he left before anything came of it. No one ever followed up." Angela thanked Sarah for the information, maintaining her professional composure. But inside, her mind was racing. She thought about telling Marcus, her police captain husband, but she wanted to handle this herself first. Still, she carefully typed up Sarah's revelation and added it to her growing file of incidents. That evening, as Angela was leaving school, she noticed Werner watching her from his office window. Instead of feeling intimidated, she stood taller. She remembered what her grandmother used to say: "Sometimes people will hate you for being excellent. Keep being excellent anyway." In the parking lot, she found a group of her students had decorated her classroom door with positive messages and thank you notes. "Best English teacher ever," one read. "Thanks for making us think," said another. Werner might be trying to break her spirit, but her students' support strengthened her resolve. On her drive home, Angela finally decided it was time to talk to Marcus. Not because she couldn't handle the situation, but because she was starting to see a pattern that needed to be stopped. Not just for her, but for any teacher who might come after her. What she didn't know was that Werner's behavior was about to escalate in ways that would make her documentation even more crucial. The autumn leaves were falling outside Riverside High School when Principal Werner's harassment of Angela Thompson reached a new level. The morning started with an email from him demanding she attend an emergency meeting during her only free period. The subject line read, "Urgent. Concerns about your performance." Angela took a deep breath and opened her documentation folder on her computer. Before heading to the meeting, she pressed the record button on her phone, a habit she had developed over the past month. As she walked to Werner's office, several teachers gave her supportive nods. They had all witnessed what was happening. Werner wasn't alone in his office. He had brought in Mr. Peterson, a senior teacher known for always agreeing with the principal. "Mrs. Thompson," Werner started, his voice dripping with fake concern. "We've received complaints about your teaching methods." "May I know the nature of these complaints?" Angela asked calmly, her hands folded in her lap. She noticed Werner's eye twitch at her professional demeanor. "Students are saying your class discussions are too politically charged," Werner claimed. "And some parents are concerned about the books you're teaching." Angela pulled out her lesson plans and the official curriculum guide. "These are the exact same books and discussion topics that have been taught at Riverside for the past 10 years, she stated firmly. "I have the previous year's syllabi to prove it." Werner's face turned red. "Well, perhaps they weren't taught with such intensity before," he stammered. Mr. Peterson looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with both of them. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Sarah Miller, the English department head, entered with a stack of papers. "Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, though her timing seemed perfectly planned. "But I have the latest student performance reports. Angela, your students' practice AP exam scores are the highest we've seen in 5 years." Werner dismissed them all quickly, but the damage to his narrative was done. As Angela walked back to her classroom, Sarah whispered, "He tried to schedule that meeting when I would be teaching. He didn't know I switched classes with Mrs. Chen today." The next day, Werner's tactics changed. He sent out a memo requiring all teachers to submit their lesson plans 2 weeks in advance, a policy clearly aimed at Angela, as she was the only new teacher in a core subject. But Angela was prepared. She stayed up late that night and submitted plans for the entire month, each one meticulously detailed. During lunch duty, Angela overheard 2 students talking. "Did you hear what Principal Werner said about Mrs. Thompson?" One whispered. "My mom works in the office, and she heard him telling someone she only got hired because of diversity requirements." The other student looked shocked. "But she's the best teacher we have." Angela maintained her composure, but inside her anger grew. She had earned her position through years of hard work and excellent results. That evening, she finally told her husband Marcus everything. Marcus listened carefully, his police captain's training evident in how he took notes. "Baby," he said gently, "what he's doing isn't just unfair, it's illegal. You got more than enough evidence for a harassment case." The next morning, Werner tried a new approach. He called an assembly for all AP students and announced changes to the grading policy, specifically targeting the types of assignments Angela used most effectively. But he had made a mistake. He hadn't consulted the school board, as required by district policy. Parents started calling the school, confused about the sudden changes. Many specifically praised Angela's teaching methods and questioned why successful strategies were being abandoned. The school secretary, Mrs. Martinez, made sure to forward all these emails directly to both Werner and the school board. By Friday, tension in the school was at an all-time high. Teachers were openly taking sides, with most supporting Angela. Some had even started wearing small blue ribbons, the school's color, as a quiet symbol of solidarity. Werner noticed and banned non-professional accessories through another memo. As Angela packed up for the weekend, she found a note slipped under her door. It was from a former teacher. "Werner forced me to leave last year. Don't let him win. We're all watching, and we're all behind you." She took the note home to add to her growing file of evidence. What Werner didn't realize was that his escalating behavior wasn't breaking Angela. It was building a case against him, and every new incident made that case stronger. One chilly October evening, Angela Thompson sat at her kitchen table surrounded by supportive colleagues. Sarah Miller, Melissa Chen, and 3 other teachers had come to her home to help organize the growing evidence against Principal Werner. What started as a documentation meeting had turned into an impromptu strategy session. "Look at this pattern," Sarah said, spreading out printed emails. "Every time your students excel, Werner finds a new way to criticize you the next day." She pointed to a timeline they had created, showing the direct correlation between Angela's successes and Werner's increased harassment. Melissa Chen added another paper to the pile. "He scheduled me to observe your class last week, probably hoping I'd find something wrong. Instead, I wrote a glowing review. He was so angry he crumpled my report right in front of me." The doorbell rang, and Marcus Thompson arrived home earlier than expected. The teachers fell silent, not knowing how Angela's husband would react to their informal meeting. Marcus walked in, still in his police captain's uniform, and immediately sensed the tension. "Ladies," he said with a warm smile, "please don't stop on my account. Actually, I might be able to help." He loosened his tie and sat down at the table. "I've handled discrimination cases from the law enforcement side. I know exactly what kind of evidence holds up." The teachers watched in amazement as Marcus pulled out a legal pad and started explaining the proper way to document workplace harassment. "Time, date, location, witnesses," he said, drawing columns on the paper. "And always note if anyone else was treated differently in similar situations." Angela looked at her husband with pride. This was why she had fallen in love with him. His desire to protect and serve went far beyond his police work. He was always fighting for justice, no matter the situation. Just then, Mrs. Martinez, the school secretary, called Angela. "You need to know something," she whispered into the phone. "Werner just ordered your personnel file. He's looking for anything he can use against you. But don't worry. I made copies of everything last week, including all the positive parent emails he tried to hide." The group spent the next hour reorganizing their evidence using Marcus's system. They had emails, recordings, witness statements, and even photographs of Werner's different treatment of other teachers. Sarah had kept copies of all department meeting minutes, showing how Werner consistently targeted Angela's teaching methods while praising similar techniques used by white teachers. "Remember when he criticized your test scores for being too high?" Melissa asked. "I pulled the school's historical data. Your students' improvement rates are actually consistent with excellent teaching methods. You can't argue with these numbers." As they worked, Marcus noticed something interesting. "These incidents," he said, pointing to several entries, "they'd all happened right after parent-teacher conferences where parents praised Angela. He's not just racist. He's threatened by her success." The kitchen table had become a command center of sorts. Pictures, documents, and timeline charts covered its surface. Marcus brought everyone coffee while they worked, and the atmosphere shifted from worried to determined. "Look what my students gave me today," Angela said, pulling out a stack of handwritten letters. Her AP students had written about how her teaching had improved their understanding and love of literature. Werner can't argue with their voices. Around 9 p.m., as the teachers were preparing to leave, Marcus's phone rang. It was his colleague from the Civil Rights Division of the police department. "I've reviewed everything you sent," the voice on the speaker said. "This is definitely a case of workplace harassment with racial discrimination. Has your wife considered legal action?" The room fell silent. Angela looked at her support system, her dedicated colleagues, her loving husband, and even her students' parents who had been sending supportive emails. She hadn't wanted it to come to this, but Werner had left her no choice. "Yes," she said firmly, speaking into Marcus's phone. "I think it's time to take legal action, not just for me, but for every teacher who came before me and anyone who might come after." As her colleagues hugged her goodbye, each promised to stand as witnesses if needed. Marcus wrapped his arm around Angela's shoulders as they walked their guests out. "You're not alone in this fight," he reminded her. And that's what Werner doesn't understand. He thinks he's taking on one teacher, but he's actually taking on an entire community. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. Angela Thompson walked into Riverside High School, carrying both her usual teaching materials and a thick folder of student achievements. Her AP English students had just scored exceptionally well on their quarterfinals, with results far above the district average. Principal Werner's voice crackled over the intercom at 9:15 a.m. "Mrs. Thompson, report to my office immediately." The tone of his voice made several students look up worriedly at their teacher. Angela calmly asked Mrs. Chen to watch her class and walked to the office, her phone recording in her pocket. In the principal's office, Werner wasn't alone. He sat behind his desk with Mr. Peterson and a woman Angela had never seen before. "This is Ms. Roberts from District Administration," Werner said, not bothering to let the woman introduce herself. "We need to discuss your teaching methods." Angela noticed Ms. Roberts looked uncomfortable, shifting in her seat and avoiding eye contact. Something felt off about this meeting. "Your test scores are suspiciously high," Werner began, his face reddening. "Much higher than our other AP classes. Are you helping your students cheat, Mrs. Thompson?" The accusation hung in the air like a thundercloud. Angela felt her hands shake slightly, but her voice remained steady. Are you suggesting that my students' success is due to cheating rather than effective teaching methods? Well, Werner sneered, it's rather unusual for someone like you to achieve such results in your first year here. Ms. Roberts's head snapped up. Mr. Werner, I don't think. Let me finish. Werner interrupted, standing up and leaning over his desk. We have certain standards at Riverside, certain traditions. And you come in here, disrupting everything with your diverse teaching methods and your cultural discussions. Angela remained seated, her phone still recording. Mr. Werner, could you clarify what you mean by someone like me and why you put air quotes around the word diverse? Werner's face turned purple. Don't play games with me. You know exactly what I mean. You got this job because of quotas, not qualifications. And I've had enough. Ms. Roberts stood up abruptly. This meeting is over. Mr. Werner, I think you should. But Werner was beyond stopping. He pulled out a paper from his desk. I'm putting you on immediate administrative leave, pending an investigation into your testing procedures. Sign this now. At that moment, Sarah Miller burst into the office. Angela, don't sign anything. The district superintendent is on the phone. He needs to speak with you immediately. Werner's face went from purple to pale. What? Why would the superintendent? Because, Sarah said firmly, I called him 20 minutes ago when I overheard you arranging this illegal meeting. Ms. Roberts isn't from district administration. She's your friend who teaches at another school. Did you think we wouldn't check? The fake Ms. Roberts grabbed her purse and hurried out of the office. Mr. Peterson followed quickly, leaving Werner alone to face Angela and Sarah. Angela stood up, her full height matching Werner's. Everything you just said is recorded, Mr. Werner. Every racist implication, every false accusation, every attempt to fraudulently put me on leave. Would you like to hear it played back? Werner slumped in his chair, the reality of his situation finally hitting him. You can't prove anything, he mumbled, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually, Sarah added, we can prove everything. Every email, every unfair evaluation, every discriminatory action. And now this. She held up her own phone, which had also been recording. Angela gathered her belongings calmly. I suggest you contact your lawyer, Mr. Werner. Mine will be in touch. As she turned to leave, she heard Werner's desperate voice behind her. Wait, who's your lawyer? Maybe we can work something out? Angela paused at the door. Oh, you'll find out soon enough. By the way, my husband, you know, Police Captain Thompson, he sends his regards. He's very interested in civil rights violations. The look of shock on Werner's face was priceless. He hadn't known about her husband's position, and now the full weight of his actions was crashing down on him. As Angela walked back to her classroom, teachers and students alike noticed her confident stride. The breaking point had come and gone, but Angela Thompson hadn't broken. Instead, she had caught her harasser in his own trap, and now justice would finally be served. The conference room at Johnson & Martinez law firm buzzed with activity 1 week after the confrontation with Principal Werner. Angela Thompson sat at a large oak table, surrounded by 3 civil rights attorneys, her husband Marcus, and a growing mountain of evidence. Mrs. Thompson, said lead attorney Lisa Martinez, spreading out documents, you've given us one of the strongest discrimination cases I've seen in 15 years of practice. She held up Angela's carefully organized folder. Your documentation is exceptional. Marcus squeezed his wife's hand under the table. He was still in his police captain's uniform, having come straight from work. The legal team had been especially interested when they learned about his position in the force's Civil Rights Division. Look at this timeline, Attorney Martinez continued, pointing to a large chart on the wall. Red dots marked every incident of Werner's harassment, growing more frequent over time. Blue dots showed Angela's teaching achievements and positive evaluations. The pattern was crystal clear. Sarah Miller and 3 other teachers waited in the lobby, ready to give their statements. Mrs. Martinez, the school secretary, had also come with a surprise. She had kept copies of every discriminatory memo Werner had tried to delete from the school system. He just called again, said the young associate attorney, walking in with a coffee pot. Werner's lawyer wants to discuss a settlement. Angela shook her head. This isn't about money, she said firmly. This is about making sure he never does this to another teacher. Just then, Angela's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from a teacher at Werner's previous school. Heard what's happening. He did the same thing to me 2 years ago. I'm ready to testify. The attorneys exchanged excited looks. This was exactly what they needed. Proof of a pattern. 3 more former teachers from different schools had already come forward with similar stories about Werner. Tell us about the fake administrator, Attorney Martinez said, opening a new notebook. As Angela described the meeting, Marcus's police training kicked in. That's criminal impersonation, he noted. And attempting to force you to sign documents under false pretenses could be considered fraud. The legal team worked through lunch, building an airtight case. They had recordings, emails, witness statements, and now evidence of previous incidents. But the strongest piece of evidence was still to come. Around 2 p.m., a student's parent walked in. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a respected statistician from the local university. She had analyzed 5 years of Werner's personnel decisions. The data is undeniable, Dr. Chen explained, showing charts on her laptop. Under Werner's leadership, minority teachers were 3 times more likely to receive negative evaluations, be denied resources, or face disciplinary actions. The statistical probability of this happening by chance is less than 0.01%. The lawyers added her analysis to their growing file. Werner had made a crucial mistake. He had left a paper trail of discrimination that went back years. There's something else, Marcus said, pulling out his own folder. I had my team look into complaints filed against Werner at other schools. We found 5 similar cases that were quietly settled. The victims had to sign non-disclosure agreements. Attorney Martinez smiled. Those agreements won't hold up if they're covering up civil rights violations. We can subpoena those records. By late afternoon, the case had grown beyond just Angela's experience. It had become about exposing a system that had protected Werner for years while forcing good teachers out of their jobs. The school board meets next week, Sarah Miller reported, coming in from the lobby. They've added Werner's conduct to the agenda after receiving our initial complaint. Angela looked at the wall of evidence they had built. Photos, documents, charts, and statements covered every surface. Each piece told part of the story of Werner's discrimination. We're not just building a case, Attorney Martinez said, standing up to address the room. We're building a movement for change. Mrs. Thompson's courage in standing up to Werner will protect future teachers from experiencing the same discrimination. As they wrapped up the meeting, more text messages arrived from teachers at other schools. Word had spread about Angela's case, and others were finding the courage to speak up about similar experiences. Marcus helped Angela gather her things, proud of how his wife had transformed from a victim of harassment into a leader for change. Ready to go home, honey? He asked. Angela looked around the room one last time, at all the evidence they had collected. Yes, she said confidently. But we're not just going home. We're going to make history. The school board meeting room was packed on a cold November evening. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls. Principal Werner sat alone on one side, looking much smaller without his usual authority. His lawyer kept whispering in his ear, but Werner's face showed growing panic. The school board president, Dr. James Wilson, called the emergency meeting to order. Television cameras from 2 local news stations pointed at the long table where the board members sat. This was no longer just a school issue, it had become a community event. We are here to review the evidence of discriminatory practices at Riverside High School, Dr. Wilson announced, his voice firm. The board has received extensive documentation, and we have invited independent investigators to present their findings. Angela Thompson sat with her legal team, her husband Marcus, and a group of supportive teachers. She watched as Werner shifted uncomfortably in his seat when the first investigator stepped up to the podium. Our investigation has uncovered a disturbing pattern, said Ms. Rodriguez, the lead investigator. She clicked through slides showing years of data. Under Mr. Werner's leadership, minority teachers were systematically harassed, denied resources, and pushed out of their positions. Werner's lawyer tried to interrupt, but Dr. Wilson silenced him with a raised hand. Let the investigation team finish their presentation. The next slide showed Angela's case in detail. Text messages, emails, and recordings appeared on the screen. The room gasped when they played the recording of Werner's final confrontation, where he had tried to force Angela to sign papers with a fake administrator present. That's illegal, someone in the audience shouted. Werner sank lower in his chair. Then came the parade of witnesses. Former teachers from Werner's previous schools stood up one by one. They told similar stories of discrimination, unfair evaluations, and forced resignations. Each story made Werner look more guilty. Sarah Miller presented the English department's records. Look at these supply requests, she said, showing 2 different forms. White teachers got their supplies within days. Mrs. Thompson's identical requests were lost or denied repeatedly. Mrs. Martinez, the school secretary, revealed her collection of deleted emails and memos. Mr. Werner told me to destroy these, she said firmly. I kept copies because I knew it was wrong. The biggest surprise came when Dr. Chen presented her statistical analysis. The probability of these patterns occurring by chance is virtually 0, she explained, showing clear graphs. This was systematic discrimination. Werner finally cracked under the pressure. He stood up suddenly, his face red. You don't understand. These people are changing everything. They're not following our traditions. What traditions would those be, Mr. Werner? Marcus asked calmly from his seat, his police captain's badge visible on his chest. The tradition of discrimination? The room fell silent. Werner had just confirmed everything in front of cameras and witnesses. His lawyer put his head in his hands. Student representatives spoke next. Mrs. Thompson is the best teacher we've ever had, said Maria Rodriguez, a senior AP student. She taught us to think critically and believe in ourselves. Mr. Werner tried to stop her because he was jealous of her success. Parents followed with their own testimonies. They showed emails where Werner had dismissed their praise at Angela's teaching. One parent, a civil rights lawyer himself, described how Werner had tried to discourage him from supporting Angela's teaching methods. Near the end of the meeting, Attorney Martinez stood up. We have evidence that Mr. Werner has done this at 3 different schools, she announced. Each time, he forced teachers to sign non-disclosure agreements. But those agreements are void because they covered up civil rights violations. The school board members looked at each other gravely. Dr. Wilson called for a brief recess to discuss the evidence. When they returned, their decision was unanimous. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented today, Dr. Wilson announced, we are immediately terminating Mr. Werner's employment. We are also recommending a full state investigation into his actions at previous schools. Werner stormed out of the room, leaving his lawyer behind. As he pushed through the door, he came face to face with Angela's entire AP English class, standing in silent protest with signs supporting their teacher. The meeting ended with the board announcing a new district-wide anti-discrimination policy. They asked Angela to help develop it, recognizing that her careful documentation had exposed problems that went far beyond one principal. As the crowd began to leave, Marcus hugged his wife tightly. You did it, he whispered. But Angela shook her head. We did it, she corrected him, looking at all the people who had stood up for justice. All of us together. 6 months after Werner's dismissal, Riverside High School had transformed. On a bright spring morning, Angela Thompson stood in the school's auditorium, addressing a crowd of educators from across the state. The banner behind her read, Educational Equity Conference, Building Inclusive Schools. What happened at Riverside wasn't just about one principal, Angela said into the microphone, her voice strong and clear. It was about changing a system that allowed discrimination to go unchecked for years. The audience, filled with teachers, administrators, and education officials, nodded in agreement. In the front row, Marcus sat proudly in his police captain's uniform. Next to him were Sarah Miller, Melissa Chen, and other teachers who had supported Angela through her fight. They had all become leaders in the school's new Diversity and Inclusion Committee. The changes at Riverside had been dramatic. The new principal, Dr. Janet Rodriguez, had implemented strict anti-discrimination policies. Every hiring decision, resource allocation, and disciplinary action was now carefully monitored for fairness. Teachers of all backgrounds were thriving under the new leadership. Remember this, Angela continued, showing slides of her documented evidence. Documentation is your power. Every email, every meeting, every unfair decision. Record it all. Your voice matters. The state investigation into Werner had revealed discrimination cases at 5 different schools. Because of Angela's case, 23 teachers who had been forced out of their jobs were now being contacted for compensation and possible reinstatement. Werner's story had made national news. He tried to apply for principal positions in other states, but his record followed him. Last anyone heard, he was working at a private tutoring center where his every action was closely monitored. After Angela's presentation, a young black teacher approached her with tears in her eyes. "I'm facing similar discrimination at my school," she whispered. "Your story gave me courage to speak up. My documentation starts today." The conference broke for lunch, and Angela found herself surrounded by supporters. Dr. Chen showed her the latest statistics. Student performance had improved across all demographics since the new policies were implemented. "Turns out," Dr. Chen said with a smile, "when you treat teachers fairly, everyone benefits." Mrs. Martinez, still the school secretary, handed Angela a stack of letters. "These came from teachers across the country," she explained. "They're all standing up to discrimination now, using your case as a guide." The afternoon session focused on the new state law that had been passed in response to Angela's case. Called the Thompson Rule, it required schools to maintain transparent records of all personnel decisions and established clear channels for reporting discrimination. Sarah Miller took the stage to explain how the English department had flourished. "Without Werner's interference, our AP pass rates are the highest they've ever been," she reported. "Mrs. Thompson's teaching methods are now being adopted district-wide." After the conference, Angela returned to her classroom. Her students had decorated it with newspaper clippings about her case and inspirational quotes about justice. One poster read, "Mrs. Thompson taught us more than literature. She taught us courage." That evening, the school board held a special ceremony. They officially renamed the school's Teaching Excellence Award the Angela Thompson Award for Educational Leadership. The first recipient would be announced at the end of the year. At home later, Angela and Marcus sat on their porch, reflecting on the journey. "Did you ever imagine it would lead to all this?" Marcus asked, holding her hand. Angela smiled, remembering the scared but determined teacher she had been just months ago. "You know what made the difference?" she said. "It wasn't just standing up to Werner. It was having people like you, Sarah, and all the others standing with me." Her phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer. The state had just approved funding for a new teacher protection program, inspired by her case. Schools across the state would now have clear guidelines and resources for preventing discrimination. "The best revenge," Angela said, reading the message, "is making sure no other teacher has to go through what I did." Marcus kissed her cheek. "You didn't just win your case, honey. You changed the whole system." Angela looked at the sunset, thinking about all the teachers who would now have protection and support. Werner had tried to break her spirit, but instead, he had helped create a movement for change. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been transformed into hope for countless others. The Thompson Rule would stand as a reminder that one person's courage, combined with community support, could defeat even the most entrenched discrimination. Angela had won more than her job. She had won a future where teachers would be judged by their ability, not their race.